Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the American University in Cairo Press, welcome to this lecture by Professor Aidan Dodson to mark the centennial of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, hosted in collaboration with the Egypt Exploration Society. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Issam Nagy of the EES for his kind and generous cooperation. In tonight's lecture, Professor Dodson will look back at how the king was first rediscovered by early Egyptologists and the various theories about him that have been proposed over the years. He will also consider what extra information the finding of his tomb actually added to our knowledge of his life and reign, and the ups and downs suffered by the king, his memory, and his remains over the past century. Aidan Dodson is Honorary Full Professor of Egyptology at the University of Bristol, where he has taught since 1996. He previously served as Simpson Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo in 2013, and as Chair of the Trustees of the Egypt Exploration Society from 2011 to 2016. He studied at Durham, Liverpool, and Cambridge universities and was awarded his PhD in 1995. He has published some 25 books and over 400 articles and reviews. His latest book, Tutankhamun, King of Egypt, His Life and Afterlife, will be published by the American University in Cairo Press in December. Professor Dodson's lecture is expected to be about an hour long, and we will hopefully have time for some Q&A at the end before our reception outside the hall. Now please join me in welcoming Professor Dodson to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nadia. Lovely to be here in this palatial room. It's probably one of the largest lecture rooms I've actually spoken in, so rather nice for that. Anyway, as Nadia was saying, I'm really looking at how Tutankhamun was first discovered by Egyptology. One often tends to think about 1922 as when he sort of first appears, but actually it was nearly a century before that that scholars first recognized that this person actually existed. I think it's always useful to sort of start off this kind of presentation with a reminder of where we are in time. Ancient Egypt we talk about quite flippantly, but it's a very, very long period of time. 3,000 years or more of history, where the country's constitution, religion, writing systems were broadly consistent throughout that whole kind of time. And from the point of view of the Egyptians themselves, their ability to look back against their own history, because it's worth remembering that for Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, the pyramids were older than Cleopatra is for us. And that's quite a thing to get your head round. And then look at how long the Roman Empire lasted compared with ancient Egypt, the UK, the USA, and so on and so forth. This talk is not about the ancient history of Tutankhamun, although one must of course start off with sort of highlighting where he fits as the successor of the so-called heretic king Akhenaten, and under whom the transition back from the revolutionary religion and art of Akhenaten started back. But in the famous gold-covered throne of Tutankhamun, there he is on the back, shown very much in the style of his predecessor. And here, possibly one of the latest representations of Tutankhamun in 3 dimensions, later usurped, like most of his monuments, by Horemheb. But this statue was one of many erected during his time at Karnak. Now, the posthumous destiny of Tutankhamun in his own era was to be removed from history. And this is shown quite neatly from the various blocks, or some of the blocks, which survive at Karnak, which once belonged to his memorial temple. which I suspect was somewhere on the West Bank, possibly now overbuilt by a later monument such as the Ramesseum. But here you can see the names of Tutankhamun scratched out on this particular block. Interestingly, it appears that the decision to write him out of history was taken slightly later than was the case with the kings who surrounded him, Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Neferuaten, and Ai, because in some of these blocks the erasures only apply to Ai and not to Tutankhamun. But then it looks like somewhere in Horemheb's reign, the decision was made to remove him from history. And the blocks of his, which were still visible, were mutilated like that. And when we get to the great monumental king lists of the 19th dynasty, for example, that of Seti I, here the element of the 18th dynasty. Sorry. Yeah. Very difficult to tell on stage how it's all sounding out in the world. So, anyway, so here, when the 18th dynasty was placed in these now canonical lists, we have Amenhotep III shown succeeded by Horemheb, and the bit of the kings in between are completely omitted. Interestingly, although it's quite clear, therefore, that the official roster of the kings of Egypt had been altered to remove Tutankhamun, it does seem that some remains of him existed in the more non-official records, or the sort of non-monumental ones. Because when Manetho came to write his history in the 3rd century BC, the late 18th and early 19th dynasty part of that is badly garbled. And it looks to be what happened here was that the person who produced this, whether Manetho himself or his predecessors as historians, had in front of them two different histories of the late 18th dynasty. On one hand, they had the official list, which simply went from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, and another one which included people like Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. And the confused list may well be the result from that. So there certainly seems to be two Horemhebs in this particular period. But there are also further garblings here as well. So it's rather ironic that one of the most famous periods of Egyptian history today is one of the worst treated in Manetho's writing. Now, the importance of Manetho and other writers in Greek and later Latin is because when we get to the end of the 4th century AD, the ability to read hieroglyphs is rapidly lost. And so the ability to engage with any of these monuments, with or without Tutankhamun included. So here at Philae, the last stronghold of paganism in Upper Egypt, we have the last datable hieroglyphic text in AD 394, which rather implies that by the beginning of the 5th century, probably hieroglyphs are totally dead. And with the triumph of the Arabs and Islam, a further break from the past was created. And therefore it meant that certainly Western scholars attempting to deal with the history of ancient Egypt were restricted to things like the Bible, Manetho, Diodorus, Herodotus, and these kinds of individuals. And the fact that for centuries the history of ancient Egypt was written on the basis of these sources is quite important when we're looking at what happens after the decipherment of hieroglyphs, because it means the scholars who were working at this period had been brought up with a version of history which was derived from these sources. And as one studies the first 3 or 4 decades, I suppose, of what one might call modern Egyptology, one notices how these scholars are really still regarding this as the basic facts And what they are then doing is trying to fit the hieroglyphs to these Greek and Latin sources. And it's only from the middle of the 19th century that scholars start managing to break away from these earlier ideas. And even today, there are various so-called facts of Egyptology, which ultimately one traces back to ideas going back to the 18th or 17th centuries, derived from study of these classical sources. Now, of course, the beginning of being able to engage with ancient Egypt in its own terms comes with the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt, and the first publication which gave extensive copies and renditions of monuments on the ground, Inscription de l'Égypte, and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which 200 years ago, quite coincidentally with the centenary of the discovery of Tutankhamun, was when Jean-François Champollion produced his Lettre à Monsieur Dacier, which kicked off the ability to read and understand the ancient material. But it's important to underline here that in 1822 we couldn't suddenly read hieroglyphs. There's often the idea that from 1822 you could simply sit and read text. You couldn't. It would not be until the 1840s or 50s that scholars could really actually read this stuff properly. Okay, fairly early on, they were able to decipher royal names. There were various phrases which they identified, but not necessarily properly understood what they meant. And this will come out when we look at the first theories about who Tutankhamun actually was. Quite usefully, 3 years before the publication of the Lettre à Monsieur Dacier, which basically gave the basic rules for deciphering hieroglyphs, but didn't give the full solution. This had been found in the temple of Ramesses II at Abydos by W.J. Banks, the first of the known king lists. And here I have restored the king list to its former location on the wall from which it was ripped in 1830. In 1830 it ended up in the British Museum, and here it is. It's badly damaged, and actually all of this is missing. So it meant that although when hieroglyphs became readable a few years later, people could make use of this list for the first time to try and compare with Manetho and so on, they could only do so for the Middle Kingdom and the 18th dynasty. Everything prior to that was missing. And that's one of the reasons why the study of the Old Kingdom and early dynastic period was held back by the inability to actually check orders of kings from a real Egyptian source. And so, as I said previously, it meant that because of the limited ability to read hieroglyphs, the limited remains of an original king list, these sources remain important. And that is really to be seen when you look at the history of the first person to really study Tutankhamun, who was Sir John Gardner Wilkinson, pioneer British Egyptologist, who had the great advantage over many of his colleagues, particularly people like Champollion or Rossellini, in that he spent a dozen years living in Western Thebes. He lived in a tomb, Theban tomb 83, high on the cliffs of Sheikh Abdel Kerna. Here it is today, with only just this one little area. Only the brick wall on the far top right, which is actually visible today. But in his time, it was a very extensive thing. The rock-cut tomb had a large mud brick addition to the front of it, which was where most of the house actually was. And this is a rendition of that part of the house where Wilkinson did a lot of his studying, and where his ideas about Tutankhamun came together. The lady in the doorway is rather interesting. She is Mrs. Hay, the wife of a Scottish landowner who sponsored a major expedition to Egypt in the 1820s. She had originally been born in Crete. She had been captured by slavers. She'd been sold at the slave market in Cairo to Mr. Hay. And then she ended her life as the mistress of a great Scottish castle. So an amazing life from a village in Crete via Cairo to northern Scotland. Quite an amazing story. Anyway, but moving on to Wilkinson and his discovery of Tutankhamun. Well, at Qunat Murai, one of the major hills on the west bank, just south of where he lived at Sheikh Abdel Qurna, he discovered high up on the hill a very famous tomb, Theban tomb 40, of a man called Amenhotep Hui, who was the viceroy of Nubia under Tutankhamun. And it has very many famous paintings. For example, this one, which I think has been reproduced in almost every book there is on ancient Egypt, showing slaves, gold, and animals from Nubia being brought in. But from the point of view of our story here, it has two representations of Tutankhamun, and these were recognized by Wilkinson, who was able to read his hieroglyphs, the hieroglyphs of his names, but noted that the names had been damaged. Not severely, so you couldn't read them at all, but he noted they'd been damaged. He also spent time, of course, across the river in Karnak, and there he was also following up the evidence of inscriptions there. And all of this work culminated in two volumes published in 1828 and 1830 called the Materia Hieroglyphica, which is one of the most important works ever produced on ancient Egyptian history, because this is really one of the first ones to actually get to grips with the problems. Champollion and Rossellini were in Egypt at this time and also doing work, but in many cases it was Wilkinson, because he had much more experience of the monuments, first-hand monuments, that some of his ideas are more enduring. So having engaged with Tutankhamun from the point of view of the tomb of Amenhotep Hui, his next engagement with Tutankhamun was via this person, Algernon Percy, later the 4th Duke of Northumberland, one of the great landowners of the United Kingdom. At the time he was known as Baron Prudhoe, and he travelled up the Nile and was one of the first Western travellers to make it up all the way to Jebel Barkal. Not the first, but among the first. Ahead of him had been the Frenchman Cayor, and this is a representation of Jebel Barkal by Cayor. And the things we're interested here are the lions, which are just drawn in the foreground here. These are now in the British Museum, having been brought down the Nile on Prudhoe's orders, and Wilkinson will have seen them while they were passing through Luxor. Again, by being a permanent resident at Luxor, he was able to really inspect any objects which were being found by other people, being transported through. Again, that really made him a very powerful individual from the point of view of the early study of Egyptology. Of the two of them, the one which is important from the point of view of Tutankhamun is EA2. Because the base of this has an inscription which was inscribed under Tutankhamun and talks about how this lion, which had been begun for Amenhotep III, was finally put in place. This is the text, and it's important to emphasise again that when Wilkinson was reading this, he couldn't read it all properly. He could read bits of it. He could read the hieroglyphs, he could read the cartouches, and he could recognise a few phrases, but not necessarily understand quite what they meant. So he was able to spot Amenhotep III. He was able to spot Tutankhamun. But also note that Tutankhamun's names here, as was the case in the tomb of Amenhotep Hui, his names had been damaged. They were still readable, but they were damaged. So he was able to say, well, the two monuments I have so far for Tutankhamun, both of them he's been attacked in some way. He recognises that the phraseology implies some kind of link between Tutankhamun and Amenhotep III. He can't quite understand the words which we now translate as he made monuments for. He knew it meant there was some kind of connection. He couldn't quite at this point know what that connection was. And of course his next thing was to try and work out what the relationship was. And he went to look at the Abydos king list, and as I pointed out earlier, that we have Amenhotep III there, and according to the lions, Tutankhamun ought to belong somewhere in the region of Amenhotep III. But where is he? There's no sign of him on the king list. So what did Wilkinson do? Well, the only other source he had was Manetho, the 3rd century BC Egyptian historian. And then when he looked at some of the quotations from it, because it's important to recognise again, Manetho, we don't have the complete version, all we have are quotes from it by other ancient writers. Well, he found this in Manetho, in one of the copies of Manetho. And he found this, that there was a king called Armaeus, and at the end of this time he was banished from the land of Egypt, fleeing from his brother Aegyptus. He escaped to Greece, and after capturing Argos, he held sway over the Argives. And so therefore what Wilkinson sort of thought here was, well, could it be that Armaeus is Tutankhamun and Amenhotep III is Ramesses called Aegyptus? And the explanation why Tutankhamun is not on the king list is because he had a conflict with his brother, as he interpreted it, Aegyptus, Amenhotep III, and was banished from Egypt. So having been banished from Egypt, that's the reason why his names are damaged on the monuments. And because he'd been banished from Egypt, he was no longer on the official list of kings. And so therefore, Wilkinson's theory was that where did Tutankhamun end up? Well, he ended up here, in Argos, in southern Greece. And that is the reason why he was no longer on the king lists. Now, of course, for us today, that seems ridiculous. However, if you're sitting there in 1828 or 1830, all you've got are these damaged cartouches. You've got what seems to be the official king list of Egypt for this period, the Abydos one. You've got to try and do something. And I think that's important to recognise when we're looking back at our predecessors as historians of Egypt, is not to ridicule those who produced ideas which we now think are strange, silly, mad, but recognise how they came about them, and also recognise that some of our theories today will probably be thought to be completely mad by people in 100 years from now. Scholarship moves on. And yes, as some colleagues are nodding there are some people nowadays who think their contemporary colleagues are mad as well. So, but leaving aside the question of why he's missing, and in fact I think Wilkinson steps back from this theory quite early on, but he does indeed document Tutankhamun, and he is able to highlight his cartouches and notes he is in this area, which was not something which all scholars at this period were able to do. So he's moving on. He makes an important contribution here. As far as further material relating to Tutankhamun is concerned, in 1840, Émile Christ-Davant observes this block in the second pylon at Karnak. It's still there, as I'm told by Mark Gabold. This is a hunting scene of Tutankhamun with the cartouches intact, and like all the other blocks of his, or most of the other blocks of his, which have been found at Karnak, reused mainly in the pylons that have been built by Horemheb, but this is probably again from his memorial temple. By the time we get to the 1850s, Egyptology is moving on somewhat, and some new ideas are coming together regarding the late 18th dynasty. Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten, is now being recognised as a character, and also there is some understanding coming about the religious revolution, the artistic revolution, and so on. Leading figure in this is Richard Lepsius, the Prussian scholar who led the great expedition to Egypt in the 1840s. And this was how he saw the royal family. Basically, he saw most of the protagonists of the late 18th dynasty as children of Amenhotep III, with Horemheb and Tutankhamun as brothers, alongside Akhenaten as well. So that's the sort of picture which is emerging in the middle of the 19th century and remains a popular viewpoint well into the latter part of the 19th century. More data regarding Tutankhamun comes out in 1850 when Auguste Mariette discovers one of the Apis burials which had been made during Tutankhamun's reign. And therefore here from 1850 to 1852 discovery, we have got the four very fine canopic jars of the Apis of Tutankhamun. Its date confirmed by these faience beads, which are the end of a flail scepter. So up until until the 1870s, people were reasonably happy that Tutankhamun was a royal son, initially a brother of Amenhotep III, son of Amenhotep III. Doubts start to kick in the 1870s, however, when it becomes recognised that Tutankhamun was married to Ankhesenamun, the daughter of Akhenaten. And Heinrich Brugsch, who wrote a very important and very influential history of Egypt in 1879, produces this assessment of the king, which really kicks off the theory that Tutankhamun was perhaps a noble who had managed to get lucky by marrying a princess. And also, it starts explaining his erasure by being regarded as being some kind of a pretender to the throne. And really from this point until the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, there are rival theories making Tutankhamun a royal prince, generally felt to be a brother of Akhenaten, or he is an influential noble who married a princess and with the death of Akhenaten had managed to seize the throne by right of being a royal son-in-law. As far as more data about Tutankhamun is concerned, it gradually trickles out as the century carries on. Flinders Petrie, a number of his excavations in the 1890s yield material of him. So here we've got from Gorob, this rather fine alabaster vessel, now in the Petrie Museum in London, which names Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun. The following season, he works at Tel El Amarna for the first time, and in doing so reveals more material bearing Tutankhamun's name, mainly seal impressions, rings and things like that. But he is dubious that Tutankhamun is actually a member of the royal family, and this is Petrie's conclusion as enshrined in his History of Egypt volume, written soon after the completion of his excavations at Amarna. And of course there's a further Tutankhamun connection with these excavations at Amarna, because for a short period the young Howard Carter got his first experience as a field archaeologist working with Petrie. While Petrie was discovering these things at Gorob and Amarna, more material relating to Tutankhamun was becoming available via the clearance of the Temple of Luxor, that from the late 1880s onwards. Tutankhamun had been responsible for the decoration of much of the great colonnade hall in the central part of the temple. And the clearance of that revealed the Opet festival reliefs, all of them later usurped by Horemheb, but it was quite clear that the original owner was Tutankhamun. A few little extracts from the Opet reliefs and the beautifully preserved tableau showing Tutankhamun either side of the main gateway, possibly the finest two-dimensional representations of the king outside objects from the tomb. Yet more Tutankhamun material was revealed when the Karnak cachette was excavated by Georges Legrand in 1904. Bottom is that courtyard as it is today. The top during the excavations. This photo actually has some interest. It was taken by the man who wrote The Wizard of Oz, who was a great Egyptophile. But here we've got the huge pit from which tens of thousands of statues were extracted, and the museum in Tahrir would look far emptier were it not for these discoveries, and amongst them were images of Tutankhamun. Images of the king, simply the king himself, on the left there, and here in conjunction with Amun and Mut. All usurped by Horemheb, but because of the distinctive facial features of Tutankhamun's art, pretty clear who that is. And the number of Tutankhamun made statues reflects the destruction of many the statues of Amun during the time of Akhenaten. And that story is elaborated the following year, 1905, where in the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, the restoration stealer of Tutankhamun is discovered with a decree which kickstarts the return to orthodoxy, or at least kickstarts the refunding and restoration of the temples which had suffered during the reign of Akhenaten. The trail that ultimately culminates in the discovery of Tutankhamun begins in the beginning of the 19th century, when Theodore Davis begins his funding of the excavations in the Valley of the Kings. And here we have a number of the early discoveries. For example, in 1906, this faience cup is found in the valley under a rock bearing the name of Tutankhamun. Then in 1907, KV54, this little pit, KV54 here, left a very shallow pit close to the tomb of Ramesses X is found, and that contains what turns out to be the embalmer's cache of Tutankhamun, including the embalmer's cache plus also material which seems to come from the funerary banquet. And also at the top left of the screen here is this little gilded cartonnage mask, which proved to have originally been intended for one of the mummified babies which was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. But apparently the mummy had had too much linen put on it, and the mask wouldn't fit on it, so it was added to this. So the idea that there is something of Tutankhamun in the valley is slowly building up. Then we have another discovery, KV58, this little shaft tomb, and in that we not only have what was then the highest dated reign number of Tutankhamun, year 6, but also some gold foil, including this remarkable scene of Tutankhamun smiting an enemy with Ai, the later pharaoh, standing in front of him on a much larger scale than actually Tutankhamun or Ankhesenamun herself, which of course, as people will be aware, goes against the whole normal proportionality for Egyptian royal individuals. And then when the right to work in the Valley of the Kings is given up by Davis in 1915, the concession is switched to Lord Carnarvon, with Howard Carter working for him. And I certainly have no intention of giving the whole story of the discovery. That will have been told in myriad lectures, TV documentaries and so on. But just to point out that they discover the tomb in the deepest part, the central part of the valley, and here in November 1922, almost the day, not quite, but we're quite close, was when this photograph was taken of on the right there of the seal impressions of the entrance to the tomb, which confirmed it was indeed him. And it's just worthwhile looking, when you're looking at the photograph on the left there, at how deep down the tomb is. It's at the lowest possible level of the Valley of the Kings, which is fundamentally why the tomb remained untouched until modern times. I say, I'm having no intention of giving the story of the excavation. One can hardly avoid, however, showing this photograph, the first sort of view, and then, of course, the tragedy of the early death of the Earl of Carnarvon. This is his tomb on a hillside overlooking his castle in England. But, of course, the death of Earl of Carnarvon added a whole new strand to Tutankhamun's reception, because of the idea of the curse and all those sort of things. So it's also worth recognising that from the point of view when the tomb is discovered, there are a whole set of completely different aspects to the study of Tutankhamun. There is the ongoing scholarly study of him, but also there is this whole popular culture kind of aspect to it all. The core of the burial, of course, was the mummy in its quartzite sarcophagus, wooden gilded coffins and gold coffin, and here it is being examined by the Anglo-Egyptian medical team, and a view of the mummy as it was at the end of its examination. It's actually the mummy which provides the most, at the time anyway, the most important new data to do with who Tutankhamun was. Because by the discovery that he had died at the age of 18, around 18, and the skull shape was very similar to that of a mummy found a few years earlier on, whose identity continues to be the matter of argument, but is either Akhenaten or Smenkhare. There has to be somebody of the royal family. It showed that Tutankhamun could not have been a lucky noble who'd married his way to the throne. His age and also the fact that he was clearly a member of the royal family demonstrated that. And so it's important to recognise that from the point of view of the history of Egypt, those are the only useful facts which came out of the tomb at that stage. We have now analysed other objects and studied some of the texts which have given more information, but at the time the only thing it really shifted was this idea that Tutankhamun was anybody other than a royal prince and therefore likely to be a legitimate king of Egypt. The excavation of the tomb, photographs of it and a summary of what was being done was published very rapidly between 1923 and 1933 by Howard Carter. But the planned major publication, the scientific publication, was stymied by, I think, possibly the fact that probably Carter by 1933 was completely sick and tired of Tutankhamun and probably wanted to take a rest, but then he became ill and within 6 years he had died of cancer. And this is his tomb as it is today in London. And as a number of colleagues here appreciate, the publication of the various bits and pieces from the tomb is ongoing and will probably carry on until the next centenary. Volumes will still be being produced of individual groups of objects from the tomb. Beyond the tomb, in the 1930s at Ashmonain, some blocks turned up which include the hitherto only known mention of Tutankhamun as a prince. And this is my highly imaginative reconstruction of what that wall might have looked like, although I understand that Ray Johnson in the Luxor conference had some new ideas. I have no idea what those are, so whether they're compatible or not with this, I have no idea. But this is an attempt just to try and take those two blocks and imagine what the rest of the wall might possibly have looked like. Now, an episode in the history of the mummy of Tutankhamun which has hitherto been largely sidestepped is the fate of his mummy between the end of the excavations in 1933 and 1968 when the mummy was next examined. Because this is how the mummy was photographed just before they closed the coffin lid in 1926. Although the mummy had been extensively damaged during the unwrapping, which effectively had been dismembered, everything had been put back where it should be. But when it was examined in 1968, this was not the case, and it became even more clear with subsequent examinations of it, which showed that at some point between 1933 and 1968, the front of the ribs of the mummy had been removed. Also, the beaded skull cap, which had been on top of the skull and been left in place by Carter because it was impossible to remove it without destroying it, had also been removed. And along with the reason the chest was taken away was because Carter had left in place some of the collar, which he couldn't remove. But somewhere between 1933 and 1968, that had been. And the only guess is it may have happened during the Second World War. It's a time when there were lots of people in Egypt as a result of the ongoing Second World War. And also we know that there were attacks on a number of Theban tombs with paintings cut out of walls and so on. So probably people with money were able to bribe into things. So that's the only possibility. It must have happened sometime during that period, and the Second World War seems as good a guess as any. Moving on into more recent times, Tut mania in various forms has come about, and we have sort of contrast here of the very sober account by Carter on the left and various more or less sensationalist volumes produced in more recent times. And this is really to underline the point that there is the scholarly Egyptologist's King Tutankhamun, and there is the rest of the world's Tutankhamun, which the two have diverged so massively, it's almost impossible to imagine them ever coming back together again. And certainly this year, I suspect many other colleagues have had various bizarre conversations with journalists over various theories, crackpot or otherwise, and so on. So there's a whole industry out there of Tutankhamun. But on the sort of the main line of things, the CAT scanning of the mummy in 2005 managed to rule out various things, but also was inconclusive in a whole load of areas. And various physical anthropologists who've worked on the mummy have had various conclusions as to what it all means. And to close, so we've got time to have some questions and discussion. Of course, there is the final piece to this, the Grand Egyptian Museum's bringing together all of Tutankhamun's material in one place at some point in the not too distant future, but that I think is one of those, one of the great guessing games is when will Tutankhamun be, all his material will be put on display. So important to emphasise that about the Grand Egyptian Museum, it will bring everything together for the first time, because quite a few items from Tutankhamun's tomb were left behind in storerooms in Luxor, and it's one of the great things about it will be that everything will be there in one place. So thank you very much indeed for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer any questions people will have. Thank you. And the cat is finally leaving now. So do we have any questions? There's a microphone which will be brought to anybody who wants to ask a question.
Hello, good evening. I'm the lecturer Dr. Abir Adel from Ain Shams University, Guidance Department. So I'd like to ask a question about Tutankhamun. I've been so much interested in the topic for a while now. And I needed to know what is your opinion about the real reason surrounding his death, according to the medical condition of his, after the X-ray and scan of his mummy.
I have to say that I am not any kind of physical anthropologist, and all I'm aware is that there are disputes between them. The only one which seems to suggest a possibility of anything which the CAT scans show which could be a cause of death is a broken leg, which could have been a compound fracture and death through blood poisoning or embolism. As far as I understand it, that is the only thing on the body which could be fatal. The trouble is, of course, many things which kill you are not visible in a CAT scan, particularly of a mummified body. So my own view is, all I tend to say is there are a number of theories around it, but I'm not sufficiently qualified to be able to comment between them. Although there are colleagues in the audience who have that qualification, but I won't embarrass them by suggesting they answer this question for me.
It's been more related to medical.
Yes.
And from what I know after so many researches, and I asked a lot around it, and then it was mentioned to me that it's because they have the genes of malaria in the family, and he had many genetic disorders, including clubfoot, and so his feet and his bones were vulnerable, and that's why even the theory about the chariot and that he was riding the chariot and fell, this was not more applicable.
Yeah. I think it's possible, but the problem is that I know that for everybody who is sort of, I think the malaria thing is, malaria, it can be, it's chronic, it's chronic.
And then, that was
So the other ones about genetic disorders and clubfoot, not all physical anthropologists agree on that. This is the problem, that there seems to be no consistency amongst those who've studied it. One person will say, yes, he had a club foot. Somebody else will say, no, he didn't have a club foot. That's all to do with the wrappings. So this is the problem. And as somebody who has no qualifications whatsoever in this, all I can report is what people say to me on that. I'm a historian, Egyptologist, and my knowledge of that side of things is limited to what I may have been told over a dinner table by people who do know about such things.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Right.
I'd just like to ask, you said all the items will be put together in the new museum. Also, they will bring a lot of things back from England.
Well, okay, the question, the amount of stuff actually in England is virtually zero, because the things because let's say about what happened. In 1939, Carter died, and a number of things were found in his flat in London which clearly had come from the tomb. Unfortunately, they were not recognised as such at the time, because his Egyptological executor, who was Harry Burton, died soon afterwards. So a number of items which clearly did come from the tomb were then sold in 1947 as simply Egyptian objects. There was no knowledge they came from the tomb. Those, I don't think any of them are in the UK anymore. There are parts of a collar are in Kansas City in the USA, and there are some things in private hands we don't know where they are.
And that lion you showed us, what is in the museum? A lion. We saw a lion. What you said is
the lion came from Jebel Barka. It's not from the tomb at all.
Yeah, but is his name anything related to?
No, we're only talking about the stuff found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, which we're talking about.
Okay, but I think everything is important to come actually back to Egypt, right?
That is a big political question I'm not willing to engage with.
Okay.
Yesterday, Professor Nozomu Kawai proposed that Tutankhamun was a political, puppet, some puppet, and the official is, I don't know, more strong from him. What do you think?
So I'm not quite sure I quite understood the question. Sorry.
I don't know.
Is the question how much power did Tutankhamun have himself? Is that the question? And how much was he a puppet of stronger people?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
right. Yeah.
What do you think?
I think it depends on what stage of the reign. I think when he was a child, when he was much younger, clearly everything would have been directed by and Horemheb, the people who were the adults ruling Egypt. But I suspect that he probably had more involvement as he got older. I think particularly he probably was involved with the army. But I think that's probably the depictions of him in an army context probably reflect that he at least trained with the army. But the trouble is, when you're at the age of 18, you're getting to the point you're starting to get a position of wanting to exert control. But it's difficult to know how much he was allowed to do so. And those people who would argue he was murdered might suggest he was murdered at the point where he was trying to exert power. possibly. But unfortunately, this is all, we can only sort of make hypotheses about this. So I think that he probably he probably had more involvement in the government as he got older. But again, that's very much a subjective view, because there's no actual formal evidence which allows us to judge that. And that's the problem, I think, throughout when we're trying to reconstruct ancient Egyptian history. So much of it is, we can go so far with actual facts, but beyond that, it's the job of historians to come up with ideas. But I think it's important that any historian of ancient Egypt must always acknowledge that their view is a working hypothesis, which could change overnight. And there are certain things during my career where I have had to change my views completely because of one new discovery, because everything assumed certain things, and then suddenly one of those assumptions, a new discovery, a new text, showed that assumption was completely wrong. So everything just collapses. And that's on one side, it's the frustrating thing about being historian of ancient Egypt. It's also the exciting thing that you can change history overnight. And if you read to some of the things I've been saying today, that if you follow what people thought about Tutankhamun or any other king 50 years ago is different from today, and I'm sure 50 years on it will be different as well. Yes, Ayman. Yeah. Oh, we got two. Okay. Okay, one, and then there's one there. Yes.
Thanks for this lecture, but I have a question about Tutankhamun. In a recent lecture held by the archaeologist Dr. Salwa Kamil recently, she said that they found out that Tutankhamun is not the son of Akhenaten, as you all know. No, he is the son of Amenhotep III, and this is why there is a relation between, you said in this PowerPoint, there is a relation between Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. That's what's your opinion about that? Thank you.
The problem of the sort of parentage of Tutankhamun is a complex one. There's, on one hand, there is the DNA evidence. There's also indirect evidence from other sources. The idea that Tutankhamun is a son of Akhenaten really comes out of those blocks which I showed from Ashmonain, that given that you've got two individuals mentioned, a king's daughter and a king's son, you'd assume it's the same king involved, and the king's daughter is Ankhesenpa'at, so that sort of implies that. On the question of when you bring in some DNA data about the fatherhood, again, the DNA data seems to indicate that the father of Tutankhamun certainly had the same DNA as the mummy from KV55. The trouble is we still have debate over whether it's Akhenaten or Smenkhare. But also, which further muddies the water, is that a common theory is that Smenkhare and Akhenaten were brothers. In which case, if they were full brothers, the DNA would be effectively the same as each other, and therefore either of them could be the father of Tutankhamun. Then is also tied in with this are people's theories about the overall chronological structure of the period. So whether or not actually it's possible for certain people to be father or not depends on the bigger picture. The trouble is you cannot simply take a view Tutankhamun's father isn't just simply a matter of DNA, say, but it's also a question of how you reconstruct the rest of the period. So in this book, in my book, the first chapter actually goes through all of all those problems, and shows the various hypotheses and explains why some work and some don't. So that question hopefully will be answered by chapter 1 of my book. So yeah. Oh, we won that, and you've also won there as well. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you for the lecture. My name is Ahmed Mahmoud. I'm a journalist from Al-Ahram. Well, I used to know that normally royal marriage amongst pharaohs goes between brothers and sisters. So now there is another theory that Tutankhamun was not the brother or the half-brother of his wife. So does this mean we need to study more about the marriage at royal families, at the dynasties of the pharaohs, or that was a specific case according to some circumstances? Thank you.
Yeah, the question of the brother-sister marriages between kings and queens is one of the most difficult ones, because we have definite examples of kings who marry their sisters, Tutankhamun for example, but also we have plenty of examples of those who don't marry their sisters at all, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten and so on. So it's almost impossible to come up with a theory which explains both these situations. You could say, well, that only happens if there is no living sister, they don't marry them. But it is a very problematic situation, and one wonders whether or not sometimes it is to do with needs for royal power and things like that, whether at certain times it's regarded as more as you may want to marry an important family, so therefore that important family is allied with the royal family. There may be points where you don't want princesses marrying somebody who is not the king, because that might give them some ideas for seizing power. So I think there's probably some quite interest that there are things going on which of course we'll never actually see in the data, because what survives normally is the official position. So if there had been some kind of dispute like that which led to those sorts of things. But so the old ideas that they had to marry their sisters to be legitimate is an idea which has been destroyed perhaps 50 or 60 years ago. Unfortunately, we've not been able to replace that with a new proper theory, other than possibly assuming it's to do with power politics. Because as far as the late 19th, 18th dynasty is concerned, it looks like Queen T, the wife of Amenhotep III, and probably Nefertiti were members of a powerful military family from Akhmim. If that's correct, that sort of implies that the king is trying to finds it important to be in with that particular military family. So I think there's some subtle things. I think it depends on the period. Whereas probably with Tutankhamun, it was necessary that he and the only other surviving royal child, Ankhesenpa'aten, married to sort of guarantee or try to guarantee the succession, which of course failed in the end. Amen.
Good evening. My name is Ayman from Mansour University. I'd like to thank you for this amazing lecture. Every time you give us valuable and new information about the family of Amarna, and especially today about Tutankhamun. What do you think, or what is your interpretation of finding some objects in the tomb of Tutankhamun appearing the names of Amenhotep III, Queen Tai, the side look of her hair, the name of princess or queen Merit Amun, and and maybe Hormheb or something, and Maya, the high official Maya. This is the first question. The second question, what is your interpretation of find the name of Tutankhaten in the necropolis stamp, and Tutankhamun in the same place or inside the tomb? Carter found two kind of necropolis stamps. First was named Tutankhamun, and then was Tutankhamun. So what do you think about this?
Okay. The first question about the material naming other members of the royal family, I think is simply there's probably two things. Possibly a personal desire by the king to have things belonging to his ancestors, cousins, aunts and things. And we actually do have sort of such heirlooms from other tombs, people wanting that. But also there may have been a feeling that as he was the last of the line, there were certain kinds of object which should be put in the tomb with him, because that was the end of the family. I think that's part of that. The question about seal impressions is an interesting one, and I'm not sure one can give necessarily a definitive answer on it. That whether or not, the question is whether or not things which had borne the name of Tutankhamun were sort of no longer valid, or whether it was again a question of using material, again putting material away. So I don't think I can give a satisfactory answer to your second question, but I think the first one is largely to do with family and possibly recognising the end of the family line.
Good evening. Okay. So my question is about politics and power in history. So it's well known that Tutankhamun restored the priesthood of Amun, which gives less credibility to the theory of him being killed because he had the priesthood on his side. So how does this affect the way he died early on?
Yeah, I think we have to be quite careful about talking about the priesthood. A lot of assessments of the history of Egypt at this time, going back to the 19th century, have been very much around the idea of there being this thing called the priesthood as a body, which I'm not sure is actually fully valid. If you look at the way that ancient Egyptian society is structured, there are a lot of people who hold priestly offices who are actually other things as well. You've got army generals who are priests and so on. So I'm not necessarily sure we can actually talk about a block of things called the priests. We've got people who were priests, people who sometimes were priests. And I think this also ties in with the first writing of Egyptian history, because a lot of the early people who are writing Egyptian history in the 19th century are trained in European history. And one of the things about European history from the Middle Ages onwards is the fight between the church and the state. And I think quite often, particularly when you've got an unusual situation like the Amarna period, those historians had a terrible temptation to talk about the Catholic Church and the King Emperor and think about the Catholic Church as being the priests of Egypt. So I think that sometimes we've overtaken that. And I think actually, for me anyway, the important power body of the late 18th dynasty was the army. I think understanding it more in terms of a military power, who may also have made use of some of the religious power. For example, Yuya, the father of Ti, was not only a general, an army general, he was also a senior priest in his home city. So I think actually the power is much more about the army. And when you bear in mind that Tutankhamun is succeeded by 3 army generals in a row, not priests. So I think that's what the power, whether any kind of sort of exercise of power it's from the army rather than necessarily the priesthood.
Okay, but my humble reading was that during the very late ancient Egyptian period, there was a strong religious leadership, especially in Upper Egypt, during the late Ramesside period. Is that true?
I don't think we can actually say there is. I think what we can say is that religion was a very important thing. But whether one can actually talk about, again, a block of power which is to do with religion, I think it's difficult to say, because given that the king himself is actually nominally the senior priest of every god in Egypt. So I think that historians have perhaps keep doing that. I apologise. But I shouldn't wave my hands around so much. But I think that the idea that that priests are such an important thing, I think is something which I don't quite agree with.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So one there, and then one, and also one there. Yeah, I'm just also this gentleman was also, sorry, this one here, in there. Right, so there and there and then. Okay, who was it? Yeah.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for your nice lecture. I just have a quick question. With so many chariots in the tomb of Tutankhamun, and maybe some simple armaments or something, I'm not really aware, was he involved in any kind of war or fights or anything like that? Or if he was not, what was the purpose of these, or anticipation of what was the purpose of these objects?
Yes. That has been one of the big questions from the beginning, which I sort of alluded to towards the end, is the idea of whether or not Tutankhamun was actually active militarily, or whether or not these things were in the tomb simply because they were the things that a king should have. Because during the 18th dynasty, very much the king becomes a military leader, and therefore one might expect that that's part of being a king, is to have chariots and so on. The big question is how far he actually made use of these things. And I think recent researchers have moved towards the idea that he was militarily active, because the blocks from his memorial temple, which have been found at Karnak, but probably came from the West Bank originally, include scenes of him in battle with Syrians and also Nubians. And although it's difficult to be certain about this, in memorial temples, the things which are shown tend to be more things which people actually did. So, and also, if you're thinking about somebody who is a mid to late teenager, who is king, and in a dynasty where being a soldier is a really important thing, I think it's very unlikely that he would not have actually done that. Whether all he did was went training with the troops, or whether he ever actually went to battle, or whether these battle reliefs are perhaps there was a war, because we know that there were wars going on certainly in Syria during Tutankhamun's reign, whether the king actually went on the front line or was simply, in the area of the battle and sort of with advisors. But I think there is some reality to the presence of this military material in the tomb. But the question is, how far? And at the moment, we can't. But I think that Egyptological views are shifting from the idea that he was just a child who didn't do anything, towards that he was more of an active individual. And if you look into more modern times, you've got people who are in their teens leading armies in medieval Middle East and medieval Europe and so on. People started doing jobs much earlier. So it wouldn't surprise me if he was actually involved in the front line. And, it's not impossible his death might have been a result of that. If the idea that he broke a leg falling out of a chariot. But all we can do is put together these possibilities. But I think it's a quite a good chance that this reflected a real military interest by the king.
Okay, thanks. One last, just a little query. When you answered Ayman about the objects found from ancestors of King Tut, this is just maybe a silly question, but was this? What I understood from you is that this was like kind of being him referring to ancestors, right? Or because this would be a bit interesting. How would he decide that when he's dead already?
I suspect that there probably was always a royal funeral plan in place, if you like, because I think it's quite clear with the death of the recent Queen of the United Kingdom that she had ideas about her own funeral. And I would suspect that given how important somebody's funeral was to them in Egypt, and because particularly before modern drugs, you could, even if you were a young person, you could die, just like that. I suspect there was always some kind of document whereby, whether you were a king or anybody else who was having a tomb, you had your ideas about what you wanted to do. And of course then, there would also, when you are dead, there may well be people having further views. Certainly if the idea is then that this is the end of the line, so more things from ancestors might go in as well. But I think that I'm sure that there was that people had input into what they wanted to do for their tomb, definitely.
But that would be really a bit surprising, because that is, he's lived a very short life, and also.
But also, I think in those, a lot of people did die young. So I think nowadays we sort of expect to have a reasonable. But I think people were dying of diseases which we would not even think were a problem. So I think that once you're actually conscious of things in your perhaps mid-teens, you're probably already thinking about those things because of what you see around you. I think people are conditioned by the environment they're living in. So I think that possibly, even if you were, and also if you talk to sort of some 16, 17-year-olds, they think very deeply about such things even today. So I don't think it's a problem.
Okay, that's good planning right from the start of his reign.
Yes.
Thank you.
Gentleman down here, yes.
My name is Amri Sezum. I would like to ask about the curse of Tutankhamun. How many people died?
Well, first of all, the curse doesn't exist. It was made up by a journalist. We know that. The only question is which journalist. We have a suspicion of who it might have been. If that suspicion is right, he was an ex-Egyptologist who then, ironically, when he died of cancer 10 years later, was proclaimed by the newspapers to be a victim of the curse. But no text of which resembles a curse was found in the tomb. It was all made up by the newspapers. I'm sorry to the journalist who...
How many died? How many people died?
Well, nobody died of the curse because there was no curse. If the newspapers are to be believed, we're probably talking, dozens, but all of them died of perfectly normal diseases. Like Lord Carnarvon, for example, he died because he was an English lord who didn't want to go unshaven. He was bitten on the face by a mosquito, and rather than leaving it unshaven for a few days, which you or I would do if we had a nasty bite, he shaved, cut the top off, got infected, no penicillin, and he died. Another person, so all the various alleged victims all died of perfectly explicable diseases, and I think the killer, if you excuse the term, thing against there being any kind of curse is the person who actually ended up cutting up the mummy died at the age of 86. 50 years after the excavation. So I think if anybody was going to be cursed, it would be the person who wielded the scalpel for that. So, it's again, but the curse has actually taken a whole life of its own, because again, there is say that we've got this point in the mid-1920s when there was the real Tutankhamun study going that way, and all of these other ones going off in different directions.
We just have to take the last questions. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit out of time. I'm sure we have so many questions for Professor Aiden, but we will try to accommodate this maybe in the future with a virtual book talk. But one last question, okay?
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. My question is about the future of research and the different studies. I attended a couple of days of the RC event in Luxor, and I was really blown away by all the work people like yourself have done in the last 100 years, thanks to Howard Carter and his team. And looking at one area, for example, in the forensic area, what Dr. Saleh Hamdi had done, and what we're doing now at Cairo University. I mean, it just blows my mind. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm in the humanitarian field, and just interested in all of this. So specifically my question is, what else is left to do? Where do you, let's say in 50 years' time, when all of us are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the discovery of King Tut, and inshallah you and I will be there, what do you envisage needs to be done between now and then? What can be done? Where are the gaps? What else do we need to do?
I think there are a number of strands. We could actually have a whole, spend another couple of hours talking about this, but I think there's a lot of it is coming down to more and more specialized analysis of things physically. But also there's also the question of things which are coming up which we don't know about yet. The number of new discoveries which get made. We're not talking about another tomb full of gold coffins, but just one little inscription with a date which we didn't know existed, and so on. So I think what we're trying to do, I think, is we'll carry on with what we're doing, but often with even more specialised kind of level. Because even just during my time in Egyptology, people become more and more specialised at a little thing, which is a good thing because we're looking at things more deeply. On the other hand, it can be a bad thing because everybody is looking down their own little rabbit hole, if you like, and sometimes people are no longer seeing connections. So that's the downside of this greater degree of specialisation. But I think it's very difficult to say anything. I think most of it is more of the same because there's not really unless we discover some completely new way of doing things. So I think it's more of the same, and hopefully more people keeping an eye on trying to link together all of these specialist little trails, because that's a danger, is if you're so deep in your own specialism over here, something which is relevant to your specialism over there, you simply it doesn't connect. So, anyway, with that, if that's the last question, thank you very, very much for coming along tonight. So lovely to see you here, and inshallah I will see you in Cairo perhaps in a year's time. I normally try and come back through once a year, so I've got another book coming out next year, so inshallah I may come and talk to you about that if people are happy for me to do so. Shukran. As-salama.
Thank you, Aidan, for such a thought-provoking and insightful lecture. We have a reception outside where you can buy books by Aidan Dodson. Don't forget to get your flyer with a discount code so you can buy your copy of Tutankhamun, King of Egypt, when it's out in December. And our bookstore outside and on the right is open just for you, so please drop by. Thank you.